evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of our director, Susan Weber, and our dean, Peter Miller, it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this semester's lecture in the Mr. and Mrs. Raymond J. Horowitz Seminar on New York and American Culture. Now, before introducing this evening's speaker, Dana Byrd, I want to mention briefly three things. First, please join me in acknowledging the Lenni Lenape people and their kin groups on whose lands we are gathered. Second, just over a year ago, our honored colleague, Professor David Jaffe, tragically died. David was our senior Americanist, and we still feel his loss, and it seems fitting to recall him and his inestimable contribution to American history on this pleasurable occasion. Third, I want to draw your attention to the inaugural Mr. and Mrs. Raymond J. Horowitz Book Prize, which will be awarded annually to the author or editor, singular or plural, of the best book on the decorative arts, design history, or material culture of the Americas. The prize will be rewarded the prize will reward scholarly excellence and commitment to cross-disciplinary conversation. And eligible titles include monographs, exhibition catalogues, and collections of essays in any language, published in print or in digital format. And the winning author or authors or editor will be chosen by a committee of Bard Graduate Center faculty and will be honored with a symposium on the subject of the book. If you are the author, editor, or publisher of such a work, please see the details on the Bard Graduate Center website. And now, this evening's speaker. Dana Byrd is one of, I think, the most exciting emerging Americanist scholars of the moment. In her work, she engages with questions of place and the role of tangible things in everyday life. Professor Byrd concentrated in art history at Yale University before taking the winter tour master's course in early American culture. She returned to Yale for her doctoral studies, graduating in 2012 with a dissertation on Reconstructions, the Material Culture of the Plantation, 1861 to 1877. Now, Dana is assistant professor in the art history department of Bowdoin College, one of New England's and indeed the nation's premier liberal arts colleges. She is at present enviably on sabbatical leave, and she's working currently on two major projects: a book on the South Carolina Sea Island plantation in the Civil War and Reconstruction era, and with Frank Goodyear on an exhibition for the Bowdoin College Museum of Art, which will open in the summer, in late June, Winslow Homer and the Camera, Photography and the Art of Painting. Now, I met Dana through my co-editor of the Oxford Handbook of History and Material Culture, Sarah Ann Carter. Dana has contributed a wonderful chapter to this work, which is currently in production, under the title Ebony and Ivory, Pianos, People, Property and Freedom on the Plantation, 1861 to 70. And she spoke on this subject at the Contributors' Workshop held here at Bard Graduate Center. So it's therefore with great pleasure and no small degree of excitement in anticipation that I welcome Dana Byrd back to Bard Graduate Center to address us on Too Poor to Paint, Too Proud to Whitewash, Material Life on the Post-Bellum Sea Island Plantation, 1865 to 1893. Please welcome Dana Byrd.
Thank you so much for having me. Special thanks, of course, to Laura for coordinating my visit, to the camera woman, who I hope will show me at my best, and then to Ivan for the invitation to lecture to you today. Today, I'm going to talk about material life on the Sea Island plantations during the Civil War and through the period of Reconstruction. I'm very interested today in attempting to explore material life from the perspective primarily of planters, who, because of the Civil War, were forced to find a new place in the hierarchy and the social order of the Sea Islands. But in order to do this, you're going to have to put up with a few things. The first is I need to talk a little bit about the idea of gentility in material culture study. Then I'll say a few words about my larger project. And then I promise to offer what I hope will be a very brief refresher on Civil War history. Just one battle, I just mentioned one battle. Before moving on to talk about my entry point and the title for tonight's talk, Too Poor to Paint, Too Proud to Whitewash. And then I'll offer some case studies about the Post-Bellum plantation before wrapping up. And my overall goal today is really to expand our understanding of how gentility operated in post-bellum life. And I think that you'll see that rather than just hewing to this traditional theory of a trickle-down gentility, right? People at the top influence the way that people at the bottom of the social register live their lives using material goods, that perhaps it's time to push towards a slightly modified model. So when I use the term gentility, I'm really interested in that code of behavior that often uses and relies on things, art, and artifacts to distinguish different races and classes from each other and to really set up this sort of hierarchical scale. Richard Bushman, whose terrific book, The Classic Study, Refinement in America, is the scholar that really offered the model for thinking about gentility. And for Bushman, gentility operates, it's really an important facet of the cultural system, and that joins things like religion and capitalism to think about the way in which one operated in the world in the United States in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. And the evidence that he used was the stuff of everyday life. And he argued that gentility spread in two ways. One through society and the other across space. So it will come to no surprise, you won't be surprised, that those living in the United States often turn to what was considered our cultural betters, the British and the French, those living at the heights of American society for models. And then according to Bushman, all of that knowledge began to sort of trickle down to the bottom of the social hierarchy. And Bushman is very clear on this point that it is important to remember that cultural transmission is never equal. But I would begin to chip away at this a little bit and to say that in addition to sort of looking to see what people at the top are doing, it's also very interesting to perhaps, I don't know, take a look at people working in the middle, right? So when something like the consumption of tea is incredibly fashionable, not everyone could afford a full and matching set of teaware, right? So one might acquire pieces separately. First a teapot, and then as one's budget might allow, teacups later. It's also important to remember that gentility is a way of being performative, right? It really helps if other people see you acting in this particular way, and also political. But strangely enough, in his formulations, Bushman doesn't really spend a great deal of time thinking about non-English American cultures. So in other words, Native people, African people, or Creolized people. Because, and this is particularly important, I would think, because the practice of gentility is really a political construct that is about separating those people from those people at the top of the hierarchy. So how am I going to build on and tweak Bushman's treatment of gentility? By seriously engaging with the strange thing that is the South. That region from the start that fused together all of these different cultures. In the antebellum period, this would mean that including the sort of edgier sides of Southern culture, it might be important to think that 19th century Virginia gentility was shaped by barbecues as much as it might have been by Georgian mansions, or by fiddle music and banjo music and bone playing as much as minuets and French horn music. And so I would argue that gentility, specifically American gentility, is not about a real stable importation of a pure intellectual tradition from Europe. It's constantly shifting, it's messy, and it always has political goals at its heart. But by inserting this thorny question of the South, I have made this conversation increasingly complex. And I still believe, though, that the work is worth it because it is particularly vital. And it's really important to think not just about how people at the top of the social register are operating, but also how the low and peripheral, or what seems to be peripheral, might be integral to the constitution of the high and central. And these ideas sort of emerge from my broader book project, which uses a material culture lens to think and to craft an experiential and holistic history of the South Carolina Sea Island plantation. And I'm particularly interested in the moment when it transforms from a place of enslavement to a place where freedom is possible. And we often think of the plantation as this quintessentially southern place. And I think that in our own time, we still feel the resonances of this place. And ideally, I'd like to find some sort of place in American art history for the South. All right, so I promised you a tiny, tiny history lesson. Make it tiny. So I was referring to the Sea Islands of South Carolina, and I'm really interested, so we're looking at a map here. And so Charleston, South Carolina is here in the north. And you'll notice, as you follow the sort of coastline, that there are all of these tiny islands that sort of hug the coast. And this is Hilton Head, for those of you that like to play golf. And these islands made for a really particular set of historical circumstances. In 1820, there was a discovery of the cultivation of Sea Island cotton, which is this long, staple fiber cotton, and it was cultivated on the Sea Islands. The Sea Islands had this perfect combination of a long growing season and slightly damp but not too damp weather that made the cultivation of this crop possible. And in 1861, that fall, people were convinced that the crop of Sea Island cotton would be the largest ever. And in November 1861, white, shiny cotton bolls filled the cultivated fields all the way up and down the coast from Johns to Hilton Head Islands. The idea was once the fields were picked clean, this once-in-a-lifetime crop, the enslaved field workers would be able to take a break from Christmas Eve until New Year's, and the owners, after having sold these bales at $5 a pound, which is a ton, then their owners, wealthy planters, wives, sons, and daughters could anticipate all of the things that they would do with these newfound riches. Those of you that know the history of the Civil War understand that in April of that year, the Fort Sumter had been fired upon and the Civil War officially began. The Civil War returns to South Carolina in November 7th, 1861, and it changes the Sea Islands forever. Because the federal military understood the value of this especially deep port, referred to as the sort of port of Port Royal, it was imperative for the Navy to take it over so they could truly enforce the blockade. They do it, they come in with thousands of troops. The planters instantly pack up their families and they go inland and they do not return for 5 years. So that means that the 20,000 enslaved workers who are living in these islands became free as long as they stayed within Union lines. And so this means that these people, sometimes you hear them referred to as contraband, would work for wages, would receive educational opportunities, and guaranteed housing. And there are certainly people that decided rather than staying behind Union lines that they would go to reunite with members of their families or head northward. They did not want to stay in the South anymore. But a sizable population of them did. Northern missionaries came down from places like Boston and New York and Philadelphia to join and to help the newly freed slaves make their transition all the way to freedom. This is particularly important because on the Sea Islands, this is the one place in the United States where most newly freed slaves were able to have their 40 acres and their mule as well. But, as you might imagine, the sort of rise in the fortunes of people who were formerly enslaved coincided with a drop in status for white landowners who, upon their return to the islands, lost large swaths of their estates, right? It's 40 acres had to come from somewhere after all. And with the bonds of slavery broken, by the Black and white Southerners began this really delicate and protracted process of stitching their lives back together, but in a way that did not include the institution of slavery. And this is where my interest comes in. But I was challenged because there are no house museums, there are no decorative arts collections anywhere on the Sea Islands. And so that meant that to find material evidence, I had to go visiting people. And I was initially quite hesitant about that prospect, but it turned out to be really, really helpful because the owners, and these are mostly about half people that have always lived on the Sea Islands, and then many Northerners for whom the Sea Islands of South Carolina were very interesting. There are about 250 former plantations, and these owners really are keepers of the land and its history. And so I would often show up at someone's house, having heard that maybe they had some stuff that they wanted to show me, and they would often have me sit down, they'd give me a glass of tea, they would tell me the very specific tale of their particular plantation, explaining to me how the estate had evolved when they made the switch over to Sea Island cotton, and then the tragedy of the Civil War, and the fact that the government had taken over their ancestors' land, and the fact that their ancestors had become impoverished. And they often use this term that I had not heard before, too poor to paint, too proud to whitewash. So in my interactions with these people, that term stuck out, and also their propensity that I'll talk about in a moment for negotiating the world in very antebellum terms, and I can be a little bit more specific in a moment. While I'm thinking about maps in the coastline, this is a very interesting map that was compiled in 1861. The proceeds of the sale of the map were meant to benefit Union soldiers and sailors. And you'll notice that some portions of the map are darker than others. The darker the portion of the map, the higher the proportion of African American slaves to white people. So, let's see. Probably don't have on the right glasses for this, but Sea Islands are not represented on the map, but trust me, they're about there. And the numbers average about 70% African American to areas around Hilton Head, which were 80%. And you'll want to remember those proportions in a moment. So the plantations would often look like this. This is Brooklands Plantation as it looked in 2009. And I would usually say something about how lovely the home was, and then they would launch into this phrase, too poor to paint, too proud to whitewash. And in my mind, it is classic Southern linguistic passive aggressiveness, right? We know now to be mindful of people who say, bless your heart, you should pay attention to make sure that the intonation is correct. It will always come with a lovely smile, but it's not always nice, right? And so in my mind, too poor to paint, too proud to whitewash falls into that sort of linguistic strategy. The best I can find out is that the term begins to pop up into usage in the 1880s in South Carolina. And whitewash is, of course, this really thin solution created by water, salt, and crushed lime. Sometimes it's referred to as calcimine, and it's essentially used to coat and protect interior and exterior structures. And it's really great, right? It has antibacterial properties. Apparently it keeps insects away. But when it's applied to surfaces, it's never quite opaque, doesn't really offer this finished appearance. And so it was in the 19th century really used to be added to workers' housing, and sometimes a fence, think Tom Sawyer here, but always sort of associated with the lower sort, right? In the hierarchy of finishes, paint was much more expensive, it was protective, it was decorative. So whitewash was always a cheap imitation of paint. And so for those homeowners who were referencing their ancestors, the choice was really clear, right? It's better to let one's home fall down, right? This is Brooklands Plantation in the late 19th century, than to add whitewash, right? So when someone would say to me, too poor to paint, too proud to whitewash, the speaker is really signaling to me the sort of reduced circumstances of their forebearers and the effect of those reduced circumstances on the house and by extension the land. At my most optimistic, I also sort of read into the statement an acknowledgement of the house's association with slavery. Too poor was also a direct outcome of the involvement in the slave system, the buildup of wealth based on that slave system, and then the ending of that system. So it is also a consequence. But I can imagine that in a conversation between locals, right, this sort of iterative phrase, too poor to paint, too proud to whitewash, recalls not only a shared experience, but also a claim to being someone of a particular station. It is a mantra, right? It's a prideful inflection that tends to, I think, blunt the justness of a lamented condition. So I love these sort of before and afters. Here's another one just so you'll get the gist of it. That's Arcadia, the big house at Arcadia Plantation. Oh, sorry, and I don't have an afterwards, but please understand it looks much better. Trust me. So the first thing is this sort of idea of too poor to paint, too proud to whitewash that I got from the landowners. And then the second is I would always try and line up appointments back to back to back, and I would always ask for instructions about how to get to the next destination. And it never failed that people would tell me how to negotiate the island based on antebellum sort of property lines. And so in my head, I began to figure this out, but it was always really sort of striking, particularly since it's much easier to tell someone to turn at the Walmart or the Family Dollar than it is to talk about the extent of Chaplin's land and which little road to turn on as well. And so it's very interesting to me that even though this sort of antebellum landscape is mostly gone, it is still sort of inscribed in a mental way for people, that people have this sort of mental map of an era that they actually never lived in, yet that is the era that they continue to use to negotiate and to send me through as well, I found to be absolutely fascinating. So these two lessons really helped me when I turned to the material record to think a little bit more about this particular time. So the emotions behind it, and also the sort of ever-present nature of the non-existent past. So my next pair of examples, I think we'll go back into time, we'll go back into that Reconstruction era, the sort of charged interactions between freedmen and their former masters as they struggle to adjust to changed circumstances in the wake of the Civil War. And it's really my hope that in recounting these two episodes, I can illustrate the challenges and the promise of building this archive that has been capable of documenting the arrival of freedom on a plantation. Two examples, two different islands, one St. Helena Island that you're looking at, and I'll be talking about the holdings of Tom B. Chaplin. You can see he has this sort of rust color, so you can see all of the different estates and parcels that he had in the antebellum era. So that's the plantation house, Tom B. Chaplin's plantation house at the top, and then the house of the Hutchinson family that I'll be talking about in a moment at the bottom. Just a little bit more of a close-up. So Tom B. Chaplin, Christmas dinner, 1876, he sits down, has a very meager dinner because by then he's lost his 200 acres of good cotton producing land. He has been reduced to serving as a lighthouse keeper on nearby hunting island. His wife had passed away a decade before. His children sensed that he was out of money and swiftly left him as well and went west to seek their fortunes. He had no land. Tomby, like many of the other estates, had been seized by the federal government and repackaged for sale to freedmen a decade before, so his former slaves are living on his former estate. Perhaps to comfort himself, he turned to a journal that he had begun keeping in 1845, and he reread an entry dated December 26, 1849. That is the Lightkeep house, so you can just see the comparison. It's a reduction station. Just trying to make you feel a little bit here. So on the screen in front of you is this entry from December 26, 1849. Our two maids, Eliza and Nellie, took themselves husbands this night. Their mistress gave them a grand supper, which they did not deserve. They were married by mothers Robert, the former to Uncle Paul's June, and Nellie to Uncle Ben's man Taffy. 'Tis said that they had great doings at the wedding, which I did not witness, being on the island. He's making a reference to Hunting Island, where he'd gone for a hunting trip. In fact, I did not wish to be here to see the tomfoolery that was going on about it, as if they were ladies of quality. They had out, with my wife's permission, of course, very foolishly, my crockery, tables, chairs, candlesticks, and I suppose everything else they wanted. So, as if it is not enough to return to a journal entry that one has made decades before, Chaplin proceeds to annotate the above entry not once, but twice. Try to stick them in there in red, as you can see. So after the words ladies of quality, he wrote, Christmas 1876 will be 27 years since those girls were married. They are both alive and stranger, have the very same husbands. One has a married daughter, I believe. They are now free and live on my old place. The passage that ended wanted was then annotated with the words, and some of my good liquor made into a bowl of punch for the company. And I'm happy to answer questions in the Q&A about what this might tell us about antebellum slavery. But for now, I think I'd like to really focus on Chaplin's revisions. And I find them to be fascinating because it offers a real-time response of his response to his changed circumstances. What's really fascinating is that his account is framed, both the sort of 1849 account and the 1876 account, is framed in a way that really emphasizes the importance of objects, and accordingly, I think is a prompt for us to consider the post-bellum period through the lens of objects and the worlds that they mediated. In Chaplin's revision, the aberrant use of goods features prominently. And I think this is because he had grown up in a genteel space, in a world where consumption had been really strictly limited by not just law, but also custom. These laws that we know had been enacted in South Carolina as early as 1750 dictated what could and could not be worn by his enslaved workers. And it's important to think about these laws as being not just about limitations, but they're also about definitions, right? They manifest this aspiration to construct a real order of appearance that allowed the relevant social facts, in particular about social and economic status, gender, and occupation, to be read from the signs disclosed by the clothes of the wearer. So the ability in the antebellum era to look at someone and determine their station, independent of their race or particular gender. And it's not just that those of a lower status should not adorn themselves with different clothes or accoutrements of their betters. It's also that by clothing themselves, those of the lower classes would not assume the status of their bearers, right? So don't get confused about this moment where Eliza and Nellie are able to engage in this elaborate ceremony, right? It's only temporary, and it actually does not mean that someone is actually rising in their station. And that's what freedom does, right? It turns these assumptions on their heads. Also, I think of particular import is that his revisions signal that he held a great deal of emotion regarding this changed status. He was essentially a planter without a plantation. He was no longer in possession of Tomby, this elaborate plantation that had a 5-bedroom big house, the formal garden, and a marshy expanse. He was now a light keep. The event that had involved his people that he found so foolish resulted in 2 lasting marriages. The slave system that had maintained distinct separation between plantations had been eradicated. The very slaves that had entered into matrimony across plantation lines were now freedmen and reunited on his land. The goods that were so wanted by the slaves and lent to them for their celebration were readily accessible to them through purchase in the Post-Bellum era. And there is, of course, this mourning for the liquor that I think is interesting too. This is water, not liquor. Rather, this sort of, one would expect that in a moment where he did not have a great deal of financial power, where he had no land, perhaps it would be something else. I don't know, the silver punch bowl that he would think about and mourn. Or perhaps he would mourn, I don't know, his dead wife who was no longer around. But rather, it's just that memory, right? The memory of the spirits that had been misused in this bowl of punch and wasted at a slave wedding that really still inflames him more than a quarter of a century later. And so it is a little strange to engage with the past as contained in someone's journal. But I think if we push a little bit more on Chaplin's account, we begin to understand that this longing for the lost order is sort of oddly reminiscent of a phenomena that you Civil War buffs certainly know. And that was a phenomenon by Silas Weir Mitchell, who described the idea of a phantom limb. And phantom limb sensation is any sort of that sensory phenomena that you get, which is felt when you have lost a limb, but that limb still feels as if it is there. You reach down, perhaps in the aftermath of the Civil War where you have lost your leg in battle, to scratch something that is not there. And we know that 80% of amputees experience this feeling at some point in time in their lives. And Mitchell often described how thousands of spirit limbs were haunting as many good soldiers every now and tormenting them. This like aching for the thing that is not there, this thing that is itching you but is actually not there, is a problem of perception, right? Phantom pains have been defined as the sensation of the missing, of the amputated, this sort of sensuous experience of something that is materially absent. And we might imagine, too, that in the social realm, people might also experience phantom limbs in the form of sensing the presence of people or places or things that have been obliterated, lost, missing, or missed, or just have not materialized again. So when we sort of add this lens of emotion, right, the longing for the thing that is not there, we can understand how Chaplin's account resonates with this very widespread Civil War phenomena of the phantom limb. And it also reminds us that our relationship with things are complex. Sometimes we acquire things without really consciously being aware of them until they are lost or broken. Sometimes the strangest things ambush us emotionally. And I think in interactions like Chaplin's, these everyday things are revealed to be much more than possessions. After all, Chaplin's objections are as much about the inappropriate assumption of the trappings of gentility by his slaves as they are about the loss of the object. His lament, this awareness of the importance of these objects, is really a reminder that demonstrates how objects were imbued with and gathered emotional power, and how they generated and normalized emotional practices on the part of individual subjects. What also interests me in this account is this idea that it's a way of beginning to retrieve the past, right? That we can use a thing to retrieve what Jules Brown called the feel, the affective totality of what it was like to be alive in the past. Chaplin's anger over what has been lost is so strong and so palpable, and it reminds us again that objects develop layers of emotional significance, like textures as they circulate between people. And it also reminds us that the thing itself does not need to be present to function as a site of memory or commemorations. And we might sort of extract a little bit further and understand that Chaplin's lost, lamented liquor might be viewed as a stand-in for a lost social order, right? The social order among planters that was frequently enforced and celebrated during intimate family and group gatherings. So the good liquor that he laments was more than a lead crystal glass filled with amber liquor. It represented a sort of conviviality, an ability to celebrate with one's friends, and the loss of that, right? The fall from the top of the social order was painful for the elite. Planters thus then framed the loss of their plantations, the collapse of the rigid social order, and the destruction of the Confederacy through loss, through things no longer there. But more than anything, planters felt the loss of their slaves, and they generally pursued two avenues that I'll talk about briefly for improving this situation. There is the group that just gave up. They were the ones that were responsible for finishing the job that the Union Army had started of eradicating that old plantation order. Some simply stopped producing Sea Island cotton, and instead they leased their lands for rice production, opened their lands for phosphate mining, and in horror of all horrors, organized their plantations as hunting preserves, which were patronized by wealthy Northerners. Others chose austerity as a style. Long after the war, elite white women dressed themselves in muslin and drab fabrics, even after the economic need had diminished. Let's see. Giving it all away. So there's an example of, on the left of the sort of drab clothing that survives. The embrace of Confederate Gray, long after Confederate armies had been vanquished, stood as a potent and visible symbol of the ideological threat to freedom. As an example, Mary Rowland, who was a South Carolinian, wrote to a friend that wearing Confederate stockings afforded her a vast deal of pleasure. And the rest of her Confederate attire were reminders of what was still at stake. And so too, her declaration, "I am Confederate all over and ever meant to be." 1876, 11 years after the end of the war. Rowland certainly recognized that the Confederacy was no longer viable, yet to her, clinging to these rebel grays gave her comfort. Her attire marked and symbolized defeat more than defiance, but it also redefined for a time elite fashionable attire in a way that was certainly not going to be emulated by freedwomen. And so by giving up this group of elites, whether they stopped farming cotton, or they gave up their land for a hunting preserve, or if they simply continued to dress in Confederate gray, somehow managed to find victory in defeat. And there is the other group. Some gave in, and they managed to satisfy themselves with a modicum of control over their wage workers. Some even tried to profit from freedmen's consumerism through the development of plantation stores in their estates. So someone like Samuel Ward of Prospect Hill Plantation on the Sea Islands paid workers in a plantation script redeemable only at their stores. And you're seeing one of those self-designed trade tokens there. And that was, of course, a way to pay workers much less than what they were owed. But by controlling the goods stocked in the store, theoretically, planters could control the very nature of freedmen's consumption. So if you were only paid in plantation script, and you could only go to a particular store, it becomes particularly challenging to buy things like white linen that you would like for your dress to wear to church on a Sunday. And all of a sudden, you're only limited to buying coarse cloth or so-called Negro cloth or Ostina breaks that were more common to slavery. And I think if I might put myself in Ward's place for a moment, he had to have understand those constraints as just delaying for a bit longer the inevitable, right? The destruction of the material basis on which ideologies of race and gender stood. But for most, recognizing that the ability of the freedmen to define the terms of one's labor arrangements made it difficult for employers to secure a stable labor force, many compromised. Henry Hayward wrote to his board about the difficulties of bargaining with the freedmen. The bargaining power exercised by them makes the planter a slave, far worse than his slave used to be. Hayward decided that he would sell 4 of his 5 properties and concentrate on his single cotton plantation. Former plantation mistresses, and I offer you again the image of the sort of Confederate drab on the left, and then what white women certainly had to understand is their sort of sartorial competition, this lovely dressed woman on the right. Sometimes you can just see a little bit of gleam at her finger and neck and earrings. She has on these great gold pieces of jewelry. So plantation mistresses also had to make do as well. When given the choice, most freed women decided that they did not want to work full-time and instead wanted to focus their attentions on their own homes, making do with part-time wages. They sometimes supplemented these wages by doing part-time field work, so think about that, making the choice, right, to work in the field part-time rather than in someone's home full-time. They also sometimes took in laundry and sewing tasks. And as a result, plantation mistresses reorganized their households to adapt to the labor shortage. So things like kitchens that we often see in the antebellum era as being a standalone building far from the house, moved inside. The ladies not liking to bring dishes across the yard, as slave women had done when kitchens were detached from the main house. These kitchens come inside. All of a sudden, labor-saving devices, which certainly existed in the antebellum era, yet were not deployed because there was a sort of extravagant, showy use of labor, all of a sudden became acceptable and popular. So you begin to see things like stoves and sewing machines and other household utensils being used in the war. And the stove was seen, as one journalist recounted, as enabling women who were unaccustomed to cooking, and especially unaccustomed to cooking over a hearth, allowed them to find some solace in using a stove to prepare meals. And the journalist also noted the sort of irony of the whites finally having to do their own work, clamoring for conveniences in which they would never have indulged their slaves. So as a result of the choices that freed people made, the nature of household work also changed in the post-war period. But while planters were aching for the things that they had lost, freedmen on the Sea Islands were thriving, particularly if you take this woman on the right as an example. For free people in the Sea Islands, material consumption proved to be a mechanism for African Americans to cement and to improve their places in American society. And I thought this story of the Hutchinsons would be a really sort of nice and rather brief example, case study of how freedmen managed to craft a place on these sort of plantations that they used to belong to. And I think also highlight some of the challenges of pursuing this question in the first place. So you're seeing Henry Hutchinson, who was born in 1860 on Point of Pines Plantation at Stowe Island, South Carolina. He was born son of a plantation owner and an enslaved worker. And a year after, so after the war, Hutchinson goes into farming. He participates in politics and business. He takes advantage of the land offered, the former Confederate land offered by the government, and ends up purchasing really large tracts of property and organizing freedmen into cooperatives. He was also the precinct chairman for his neighborhood. And he was so successful that he was able to gift his children with their own plots of land. And in 1885, his son was able to construct this Hutchinson House as a wedding gift. And I would say to our modern eyes, and this is a terrible photograph, I'm sorry, Hutchinson House is not really remarkable, right? It's sort of rectangular, it's 1.5 story, it features a side gable roof, with barge boards, there's some dormers, that's nice, on the front slope of the roof. It's on a raised brick pier foundation and has a shed, some additions in the back. And at some point, the pedimented front porch was also added. Yet, as humble as this structure is, it really represents a departure from the traditional housing stock of the islands. And I think I've showed you 3 different plantation houses, right? This is not the Sea Island big house, but it's also not an enslaved worker cabin either. And you're looking at one of the Point of Pines plantation houses in the bottom right. So that is another place of innovation in which the freedmen are operating. Right? They have to come up with a style that is not quite full planter elite, but certainly not a return to slavery. And so you see this sort of middling class housing instead. What is also really interesting is that often proximity is valued over style, and you begin to see people who are arranging themselves according to their family units. And when I say family here, I don't necessarily mean people related by blood, but people related by some sort of kinship ties. Perhaps they were all raised on the same plantation together. And that seems to be most important, right? Being close to people that you know and love. More important perhaps than aesthetic considerations. It's also really interesting to think about the improvements on the slave cabin model. So as you see, the Hutchinson House is sort of raised on piers, and that suggests 2 things. Architectural people, you'll know that that means that there are probably wood floors in the house with the raised piers, rather than the dirt floors that would have certainly been in the house on the right. And what becomes really interesting is that as you look at all of these different groups of people who are erecting their own structures across the Sea Islands, the only rule is that there is no rule, right? That it is not like the slave cabin, it is not like the master's house, but there is a whole sort of wild and woolly set of aesthetic considerations that are made. What is interesting about this sort of consumption is that, as you've heard me sort of hint at, African American consumption ends up controlling, circumscribing, moving around white behavior around objects. And I'm not suggesting that African Americans are emulating, they're certainly not doing that, but in their sort of eagerness to chart their own paths and their eagerness towards self-determination, they create this entirely different model that the white planters, the former elites of society, also begin to shift away from as well. Briefly, I just want to sort of note that I know that perhaps you're sitting here and thinking about, so what were the instances of violence against the group of people? Like, were these sort of the feelings and the animosity ever worked out in a sort of very violent and physical way? And I will say that seems to make the Sea Islands very different from the experience of Reconstruction in these other regions because of the relatively high proportion of African Americans to whites that seems to have insulated the people on the Sea Islands, at least, from the sort of horrific violence that we've come to expect in this period from paramilitary groups like the Ku Klux Klan, with one exception, and that is the red shirts. So you're looking at Robert Smalls. Perhaps you know his story. He grew up in a plantation on the Sea Islands in the antebellum era, and a year into the Civil War, he hijacks a Confederate ship and sails it to Union lines, thus giving the Union a ship and taking a ship away from the Confederacy, and he is hailed as a hero. He goes on to prosper. He serves as governor of the state, and has this really sort of long and important political history in the nation. And so the one instance of violence that I've been able to find is when freedmen attempt to get together, to rally, and to have discussions about politics. There seems to be the sort of planters who style themselves in this paramilitary group called the Red Shirts, and you're seeing one example of the Red Shirt on the right. And they understand themselves as having dedicated themselves to controlling the freedmen. They hope to eradicate the Republican Party, and they want to use intimidation to suppress and influence voter turnout. But the ways that they act out are against the material. So the physical violence then is limited towards men riding horses up and down the street and reaching down and knocking people's hats off, right? So the sort of pressure that is placed on former planters around this sort of issue of the rise of their former slaves, I think because of the proportion of African Americans to whites, never sort of reaches the height that it does in other places. And very interestingly enough, it is sort of acted out in this very material way, right? Striking at the sort of very respectability these people hope to have by wearing hats and organizing and exercising their right to vote in the street. So just as progress for this group was materially conveyed, punishment for it certainly seems to have been similarly meted out as well. So understood this sort of punishment towards personhood as being another means of maintaining order. So I think that the Chaplin and Hutchinson stories certainly offer this sort of texture and nuance to an account of slavery's end. They remind us of the importance of place in attempting to recover these accounts, and of course of the utmost imperative of telling and treating these stories together, side by side, right? The landscape of the Reconstruction era requires new modes of inquiry that really address the emergence of these new citizens and the reconfiguration of the social order that results. It requires thinking and writing across not just the lines of class, but also across race. And I think that's truly how we begin to engage with a past where some ache for the lost thing while others revel in the end of that lost order. The example of present-day folk who offered me that lovely phrase and also antebellum directions is also a vital and important reminder that for many people, the past is oh so present, and there is this sort of fierce pride that sort of guides their current worldview and their thinking. It also reminds us that consumption at all levels is not just about satisfying material need, rather it's always about some sort of social negotiation. And in this case, it's apparently, given this too poor to paint, too proud to whitewash figuration that continues today, always a social negotiation that really apparently fiercely continues and will perhaps be endless. Thank you. I've been told if I go and sit, then the questions will flow to me.
Exactly.
Excellent.
Thank you so much, Dana. While you're making your way up here, I just want to say how stimulating I found that. I hope that there will be lots of questions. And the floor is open. And please, questions should go through me so there's no confusion as to who points at whom can speak. Yes.
Hi, I was wondering if any sort of excavations have been held at these islands to find material evidence.
Yes.
Okay. Yes. So one of the places that I'm most interested in is this area called Mitchellville, and it was a village that was essentially extracted out of Plantation on Hilton Head. And although the village, no longer exists because of the terrible hurricane of 1893, There is, of course, a great deal of material evidence under the ground. And I have an entire chapter that is dedicated to this Freedmen's Village, what the layout was, what sorts of things people bought, how they conducted their lives. Yeah, so that's been done, but not so much on these privately held estates, which is a challenge.
Peter.
Thank you very much. I want to ask you about technology, because so two of the examples you gave made me wonder about the intersection of history of technology with your account of material culture and social history. So, the first was the kitchen moving inside because of labor shortage. But one of the reasons why kitchens were outside was for fire prevention purposes. So were there any improvements in fireproofing or in kitchen technology that made it possible to safely move kitchens in? And the second had to do with the raising up of the house on the pier, and all of the building technologies that would facilitate doing something like that much more inexpensively than might have been the case in some prior time. Just a question.
Mm-hmm. I think that unpacking that question about technology is very challenging. For the South, I tend to always sort of assume that because of the excess of labor in the South, things are produced slightly differently. And I think about maybe Richie Garrison is somewhere listening to this, but that somehow rather than having boards that have been milled like through like a powered mill, that Southerners relied on pit sawing by enslaved workers. So within a sort of excess of labor, technology tends to matter much, much less. But when one is forced to cook flowing skirts and all over an open hearth, and that all of a sudden is challenging, then those things move inside. Yes. Yes.
I would just add to that comment on the idea, especially with the cooking. There's very much of a sociological element that the white distrusted having blacks cooking in the house because they always said they were sloppy and they were going to burn the house down. So this was also sort of part of the mindset that people had, that they had all of these slaves amongst them, but they a little bit distrusted them as well. So that was, I think, probably introduced a bit of this separation. I'm an architect, so that's something I've always seen in Southern architecture, that through the antebellum period, the Southern architecture adopted the stylistic element of general Western European architectural changes, but they kept the services separated from the nice part of the living of the house, and why you find that phenomena even with the Gothic revival, the Greek revival, the Gothic revival, any of those styles, that you still have them building the big house with everything scattered around it. And unlike the English model, where they might have the upstairs, downstairs in the South, they distrusted their labor force and they dispersed it away from their interior living. And I think that also hooks into the technological component.
And then the concerns like fire don't matter. If you have to do the labor, you want the easiest possible thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
On what do you base distrust?
What was that?
You made a statement that they distrusted.
They
On what do you
distrusted
base
their,
this?
it was the basic thing, they distrusted their help. Because if you're in a situation where you're having dominance over somebody and they're somewhat, as you said, the passive resistance model, they had help that they were enslaved, why should they work any harder? They weren't going anywhere. The only threat that the threats they had were being physically abused or being separated by being sold off to another plantation. So there was, within the system of slavery, there was also the reciprocal of how did the slaves fight back. And this worked out in the whole way of the lifestyle. a lot of the white families just distrusted having the blacks under the same roof at night. So blacks tended to leave the house and were in their own quarters and things so that the white people could feel secure.
Yes, but I would also add that the one thing that this project has allowed me to really think about a little bit more carefully is the true nature, at least on the Sea Islands, of slavery. And that perhaps we have taken for granted too much this sort of separation and distinction between planters' families and their servants. And perhaps we have to sort of recognize that if one has a seamstress make the fanciest dress that she saw in Godey's ladies book, then that servant has the ability to be genteel as well, right? So there is, I think, more sort of piercing of what we consider to be the sort of very sacred core of the planter family than we are comfortable, perhaps.
Well, that's the interesting phenomena of where the help knows more about the people they're working for than the people they're working for know about the help.
Yeah,
I think we
I think that's
Yeah,
precisely.
so we should
move on.
You mentioned briefly what I think is very interesting about laws or rules. I think you said starting in the mid-18th century, governing what enslaved people could own, consume. And I was really curious if you could speak a little bit about where those rules or laws are coming from, who's issuing them. And I was really interested in the chronology of that because in Europe, this is exactly the period when you start to the end of sumptuary laws. And so I'd love to hear a little more about that.
Yeah, so the South Carolina sumptuary laws are in the mid-18th century, and they essentially lay out what is appropriate clothing for servants and what is not. And I tend to understand that those as having their sort of roots in Europe as well, and about trying to maintain some sort of distinction between one's outer appearance and one's stature or condition in life.
This was for servants, not
Just-
necessarily enslaved
Right.
peoples, right? Oh,
Right, but then again, who's enforcing these things, right? It's always great to be able to refer to this law, but truly there is visual evidence that undercuts the laws on the books, and so,
That's right.
Yeah.
This is exactly when laws are ending elsewhere, that they're starting there.
yeah.
Thanks.
Elizabeth.
Just to piggyback on that, my knowledge of sumptuary laws is that they're put in place because they don't work. You know, there's this sort of need to control because things are out of control. No, thank you for your talk. I was curious about food. I was thinking about the punch bowl and liquor and thinking about cooking and who's cooking for whom. And have you had a chance to think about food as part of this kind of dialogue of cultural relationships? Especially, I think now there's recognition that a lot of Southern cooking is, you know, African American with roots in African practices, and so I'm wondering if you've thought about food and how you might fit that into your discussion.
I haven't thought about food too much, but the sort of archaeological reports that I've read of this freedmen's village suggest that there's a much higher proportion of people that are eating meats than is actually found when they do excavations on plantations in the enslaved workers' quarters. So there is apparently this desire to switch one's diet and to sort of have better and higher quality food. I would agree with you that that sort of issue of enslaved workers and who's cooking and who gets the credit in the cookbook for whose recipe it is very thorny. I would love for someone to write about that extensively, beginning with Martha Washington's pound cake recipe, which always amazes me because Martha Washington was certainly not in the kitchen, outside the kitchen, right, making that pound cake. Yeah.
I'm going to encourage our PhD and master's students to ask questions and give them a chance at Dylan.
Okay, hi. So I found it really interesting you were talking about the post-bellum African-American family who built that house and the comparison between that house and the quote-unquote big house of the plantation. And I was wondering, so when I first looked at that house, I thought of my grandmother's house, which is a colonial New England house. And I was thinking about sources for inspiration that they might have had. I don't know if you have any more information about that, because you kind of made that comparison of establishing a new kind of house that was better, you know, a step up from the slave quarters, but separating themselves from the plantation homes.
Yeah, so I was truly not joking when I said that the only rule is that there is no rule. And to me, that really speaks to the particular joy of being free, that one could simply make the choice, right? And so as you look at the post-bellum landscape of the Sea Island plantations, you see all different sorts of houses being built by the freedmen. But if you look at the standing slave cabins, they all sort of look the same, right? So the choice to turn one's back on this history and this way of living and to create something new. In terms of influences, I do not know. I know that people are fond of making reference to what is called a freedman's cottage, but I do not know when a freedman's cottage ends and it's just simply like middling class housing begins. So another research topic. Thank you.
Yes, so you've written eloquently about punkas,
Yes.
which are the wood panels that slaves waved over the dining tables. And in one of the articles from the 1930s that you quote, it says specifically, "The air was waved, the board was moved, the air was waved." And I love that passive Southern construct. When you interviewed people in these
I
homes,
can't hear.
did they use that same language about this was farmed by, right? I'm just asking about the passive language that Southerners sometimes use to talk about how work was done before the Civil War.
No, and I'm still surprised that people were not particularly passive in their use of language. I expected that, but it was not there. There seems to be, I don't know, in the past 5 years, a real sort of reconsideration of the language that people are using in historic house museums in the South. So 15 years ago, you would go to Charleston and people would use the word servant, and they actually meant slave, and now they use the term enslaved worker, and that feels like a huge leap. So there's certainly an awareness of it. Yeah.
I'm going to ask everyone to project as much as possible when speaking, because this is a fairly large room, and at a distance it's sometimes difficult to hear someone. So, what do I? Hey?
Hi, thank you so much, Dana. I was really chewing on that idea of passive aggressive and the specific history and demographics in the Sea Islands being really different and sort of resulting in the need for more passive expressions, scribbling in a diary, because this man is so outnumbered, whatever he thinks, he mostly sort of has to keep it to himself. But I'm sort of wondering whether you think that quality of passive aggressive is more evident because of the history and demographics in the Sea Islands, and if so, is there a way that plays out in material culture in any way? Like, is there a material culture of that's more passive than aggressive?
That is a lovely question that I had absolutely no response for, but it's, I hadn't thought about.
I wondered in some of your research, did you interview black families as well?
Yes.
Because you were primarily referring to white families.
Yes.
When you were still in this plantation.
Yeah.
And how did that develop in terms of the conversation about material culture, memory, and?
Generally speaking, there does not seem to be a great deal of obsession over the antebellum past and getting it right.
But their moment in time from the Civil War on, I mean, a lot of those families are still on that land.
Right. But at the same time, there was a certain pride in the choices that they had made sense. And so they were very interested in having me sort of look around the Sea Island landscape and think about where, people had lived before. So one of the tips that I got was if you ever see a sort of a pecan tree and 15 feet of empty space in another pecan tree, that meant that was someone's home and likely the home of a free person. There was an interest in making sure that I understood the difference between people that stayed on the Sea Islands and those that left and came, to New York, made their fortune and came back. Those people that went to New York and came back and built on the Sea Islands built in brick, and that was scandalous because you shall not build in brick. That was another important facet of the history as well. And then I'm also struck that there's not a great deal of emphasis on blood connections, but the sort of looser kinship ties are very important as well, right? So they could recount the people that lived on Point of Pines Plantation at the dawn of the Civil War and understood those people as family, even though they might have not have been related by blood.
I was thinking of Julie Dash.
Yes.
Dash.
Yeah. Oh, it's so hard for me not to talk about that. Thank you, Cassie.
I'm very aware that there are people behind me, so I just want to give everyone back there a chance. Nope. Maybe later. Yes.
Yeah, I guess that's sort of a related question. You were saying that white families tended to give directions based on plantation lines. So when you say that African American families didn't tend to focus so much on the antebellum, how did they direct you around the island? I mean, did they go by more post-war or post-Civil War markers of where freedmen had lived, or were they actually looking at 21st century landmarks and giving you those?
That's a great question. I don't know what to make of it, but the answer is they acknowledged that I had a phone that could help them. And that was perfectly fine with them, right? So a willingness to accept the present rather than sort of resting in the past. It's a great question.
Yes.
We've brought up a lot of sort of aspect of the language. Did you find any residual of the Gullah creating some sense of us and them, even within the black community, or the interplay between the whites who could understand it and the resident black community?
So I would say every African American person that I met on the Sea Islands would identify themselves as being Gullah or Geechee. But at the same time, they would acknowledge being part of that broader culture. They were very clear to me that they understood that as a people, they had always understood that there was a wider world, and they had always participated in it. And it was often one of the few times that people would make reference to the antebellum moment, and they would talk about the fact that if cotton could come off of a plantation and end up in a factory in Concord, New Hampshire, then knowledge also flowed on and off of the plantation and through them. Right? So this strange acknowledgement of being part of a culture that they understood as Gullah, but also an acknowledgement that the world continues and flows on, and that there was a sort of interaction.
Yeah, just following up on that and thinking, of course, about Daughters of the Dust. And is there like a tourist industry of people going there expecting to see Daughters of the Dust and people getting sort of irritated that, I'm Gullah, but hey, we get off the island, and that kind of thing? Is there some tension with that that historical past and people feeling that they're not some like tourist, site or.
So I think that communities are mixed, right? There are people that are happy to make seagrass baskets and to sell them, and have passed down this sort of incredible ability to work with materials I cannot wrap my mind around. And they're certainly happy to have this sort of vibrant trade in that. I haven't yet met anyone that was disappointed that there weren't vestiges of Daughters of the Dust there. I'm trying to wait how much I said. Yeah, so I never met anyone that was upset that that was not visible, but there are certainly people that are happy to take you and show you all of the sort of hidden places of the Sea Islands, and you will see the bottle trees and sort of things like that as well. Yes.
I'd like to ask you something about Thomas B. Chaplin.
Yes.
Am I right in thinking that you said, I may have misheard you, that he, in 1876, when he revised his journal, that he had an appointment as lighthouse keeper?
Yes.
Now, was that not a federal appointment at that time? This is during the presidency of Ulysses Grant.
Right.
I wonder if this indeed was a federal appointment, and that's my understanding of such positions.
Right.
This may not be a fair question. What's going on?
Well, so it had occurred to me that it was a federal position, but I never questioned it even further. I don't know. I mean, I don't know. Was it a way of keeping him like calm as he had to sort of deal with people living in his land? Certainly, absolutely possible.
Good. Thanks. Any further points that anyone would like to raise?
Now is the time for your
Yes.
Gone with the Wind question.
Well, Dana, I think you have taken. Oh, there's one last one.
You mentioned all of the white bowls of cotton, that were all there in the fall of 1861. Did the Union occupiers make use of that by marketing that resource?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Now, did they return the proceeds to the islands, or did they send them to the war coffers?
So the newly freed slaves were very smart and picked and picked and picked and picked and hid all of those things for some time. And then in February of 1862, when they begin to ramp up the processing again, and the federal government says any of these proceeds will go to house you, to feed you, and to provide an education for you. But cotton started to come out a little bit. And was eventually sold, and the proceeds made it back to the islands in some way or another. It's a good question. Best cotton crop yet.
So
Did some of the African Americans that lived on the plantations eventually buy some of the land?
Oh yes, yes, absolutely.
So what kind of percentage are you thinking of?
I don't have a solid percentage, but a fair amount.
A fair amount.
And I think part of that was made possible by the fact that, like, Tom B. Chaplin didn't just have one plantation, he had many plantations. And so I think it was a little bit easier for someone to give up one or two in the hopes of retaining one. And so that put a lot more land on the market. And you would not know it today. I don't know when the last time anyone was in Hilton Head. But much of that land on Hilton Head belongs to the descendants of freedmen. And so, like, the best golf courses are on vestiges of that land, and the corporations are simply sort of leasing it for 99 years. So the Sea Islands are indeed that one place where it was possible to have those 40 acres and more.
Okay. All right.
Well, I have to admit, not to being a golfer, nonetheless, I'm looking forward to a field trip to the South Carolina Sea Islands, and it's thanks to your wonderful lecture that I feel stimulated to go there. I'm reading Thomas Wentworth Higgins.
Yes.
So, that aside, Dana, thank you so much for